Max grew up in a small town in upstate New York, a place where winters are long, summers are fleeting, and everyone seems to know each other's business. It's 2015, and at the heart of this story is a guy named Max. He's your typical small-town man, a bit rough around the edges but with a heart of gold. Max is the kind of person who would drop everything to help a friend, and most people in town respect him for it. He's worked at the same auto repair shop since he was 18, fixing up trucks and tractors, and most importantly, he's always had a steady and quiet life. Max married his high school sweetheart, Lena, right after graduation. They were inseparable back then, a couple everyone thought would make it through anything. Max was convinced that his life was set. A stable job, a decent home, and Lena, the girl of his dreams. They weren't rich, but they made it work, finding comfort in the little things. Friday night dinners at the local diner, trips to the lake every summer, and long talks on the front porch in the evenings. But over the years, things started to change little by little, almost unnoticeably at first. Lena, once a bright and adventurous soul, had become distant. She had dreams of her own, ambitions that didn't quite fit into the mold of small-town life. She started talking more about wanting to travel, to see the world, and to experience life outside their quiet town. Max, who'd always been happy with the familiar, found it hard to relate. He thought they were happy, that they'd settled into the routine they both wanted. But Lena seemed to want something more, something he couldn't quite give her. Then came Darren. Darren was an old friend of Lena's from her college days. He'd moved back to town for a job in real estate, and he was a lot flashier than Max. Drove a new car, wore sharp suits, and had this charm about him that got him noticed. He wasn't like anyone Max had ever really known, and his presence made Max uneasy. Darren was the kind of guy who'd buy drinks for the whole bar just to be the center of attention. But most importantly, he was the kind of guy Lena seemed to be drawn to. Max noticed that Lena was spending more time on her phone, texting and smiling at messages that she never seemed to share with him. She'd laugh in ways he hadn't heard in years, but it wasn't with him. She started going out more often, saying she needed to clear her head, or that she just wanted some time to herself. At first, he tried not to think too much of it. Everyone needs space, right? But as time went on, Max couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One Friday evening, after another quiet dinner where Lena barely said a word, Max decided to bring it up. He asked her if everything was all right between them, if there was something bothering her. Lena looked at him for a long moment, almost as if she was weighing whether or not to say what was on her mind. Finally, she told him she felt like their lives were stuck, like they were just going through the motions without really living. She confessed that she missed the excitement, the thrill, the unpredictability of her younger days. Max didn't know how to respond. To him, their life together was what he'd always wanted. Steady, reliable, safe. But he couldn't ignore how unhappy Lena seemed, and he felt a pang of guilt, wondering if he'd been too wrapped up in his own contentment to notice her restlessness. A few weeks passed, and Max tried to be more attentive, more present. He started planning little getaways and suggested they try new things, hoping it might bring them closer again. But it always seemed like Lena had something else going on, like she wasn't really interested in spending time with him anymore. She started staying out later, coming home with flimsy excuses that didn't quite add up. She'd say she was out with friends, but when Max asked who, she'd shrug it off or change the subject. One evening, Max found himself alone at the house. Lena had said she was going out with some girlfriends, but Max had a feeling, call it intuition or just plain suspicion, that something didn't add up. He decided, against his better judgment, to take a drive around town. He didn't even know what he was looking for, but he couldn't sit at home feeling like a fool any longer. And there it was, Darren's sleek black car parked outside a local bar on the other side of town. Max pulled over across the street and watched for a while, not really sure what he was hoping to see, or not see. Then, like a punch to the gut, he saw Lena step outside with Darren, laughing and leaning into him in a way that was all too familiar. Max felt his heart sink, realizing what he had been too afraid to admit to himself. This wasn't just a rough patch. This was betrayal. He sat there, gripping the steering wheel, every emotion he'd been holding back flooding to the surface. Anger, sadness, confusion. Max didn't confront them that night. He wasn't even sure what he'd say or do if he did. Instead, he drove back home, feeling the weight of the truth settle over him like a storm cloud. Over the next few days, Max struggled to keep himself together. He didn't want to believe what he'd seen, and part of him hoped it had all been a misunderstanding. But deep down, he knew the truth. Lena's heart was no longer with him. She was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As days passed, Max struggled to figure out what to do. The weight of what he'd seen was unbearable, but he couldn't bring himself to confront Lena. He felt trapped, knowing that if he confronted her, there would be no going back. Every time he saw her, his mind played back the image of her laughing with Darren outside that bar. It haunted him, gnawing away at the love he once felt. Lena, on the other hand, seemed completely unfazed. She continued going out, her excuses getting weaker by the day, and Max could feel the distance between them growing wider. She would glance at her phone with a faint smile, and Max knew that the message on her screen wasn't from a friend. There was something different in her eyes now, a spark he hadn't seen in years, and it wasn't for him. It felt like she was living in a completely different world, one that didn't include Max. One night, Max couldn't take it anymore. He decided it was time to confront her, to finally get some answers. He waited until she came home, later than usual, and asked her to sit down. "Lena, we need to talk," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She looked at him, her expression shifting from surprise to irritation. "Can't this wait?"
I'm exhausted.
"No, it can't," Max replied, his jaw clenched. "I know something's going on, Lena. I saw you with Darren the other night." There was a moment of silence as Lena's face went pale. But instead of denying it or showing any guilt, she simply sighed and looked away, almost as if she'd been expecting this moment. "So what if I was?" she said, crossing her arms defiantly. Max felt a surge of anger rise up, but he kept his voice steady. "So, you're not even going to deny it? Why should I? Look, Max, this life we've built, it's not enough for me anymore. I feel like I'm suffocating here, stuck in this town, in this house with the same routines every day. Darren understands me. He makes me feel alive." Max stared at her, stunned by her bluntness. He'd known that something was wrong, but hearing her say it out loud felt like a punch to the gut. "Lena, we've been together for over 10 years. We built this life together. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" She looked at him with a mix of pity and frustration. "Of course it does, Max, but I can't ignore what I feel. I need more than this, more than you." Her words hit him hard, and for a moment, he didn't know how to respond. He wanted to yell, to beg her to stay, but deep down, he knew it wouldn't change anything. The woman he loved was already gone, her heart somewhere else. The next few weeks were a blur of awkward silences, late-night arguments, and an overwhelming feeling of loss. Lena started spending more time at Darren's place, coming home only to pack a few things or to tell Max she'd be gone for the night. Max felt like a ghost in his own home, watching his marriage fall apart and unable to do anything about it. One day, while Max was at work, he confided in his coworker and longtime friend, Tom. Tom was the kind of guy who always had something to say, usually with a bit of humor to lighten any situation. But when Max told him what was going on, Tom didn't laugh. "Max, I hate to say it, but maybe it's time to let her go. She's not the same person you married. You deserve someone who respects you, not someone who's out playing games with some guy like Darren." Max nodded, but letting go wasn't easy. Lena had been his whole world for so long, and the thought of life without her felt empty. But as the days dragged on, he began to see the truth in Tom's words. Lena wasn't coming back, at least not in the way he needed her to. One evening, after yet another lonely night, Max found himself scrolling through old photos on his phone. Pictures from their wedding day, vacations they'd taken together, the little moments they'd shared over the years. It hurt to look at them, knowing that the woman smiling beside him in those pictures was now in someone else's arms. But at the same time, it reminded him of the man he used to be. A man who knew what he wanted and wasn't afraid to fight for it. With a heavy heart, Max made a decision. He would tell Lena to leave for good. He couldn't keep holding onto a marriage that only existed in his mind. When Lena came home that night, he was waiting for her in the living room. "Lena, we need to talk," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. She looked at him with mild irritation, clearly not in the mood for another confrontation. "What is it now, Max?" "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice firm. "I deserve better than this. If you want to be with Darren, then go be with him. But I can't keep pretending that this marriage is still alive when it's clearly over." For the first time, he saw a flicker of regret in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by indifference. "Fine. Maybe it's for the best." And just like that, she walked out of the house, leaving Max alone with the silence and the memories of a life they once shared. The next few weeks were tough. Max struggled to adjust to his new reality, to accept that Lena was really gone. He poured himself into his work, trying to distract himself from the loneliness that filled his days. But even in his darkest moments, he found a glimmer of hope, a feeling that, somehow, he would make it through. As he slowly started to rebuild his life, he reconnected with old friends he hadn't seen in years, friends he'd drifted away from because he'd been so focused on Lena. He started going out more, exploring the things he'd put aside for so long. Little by little, he began to rediscover himself, to remember the man he used to be before everything fell apart. One day, he ran into Sarah, an old friend from high school. Sarah had moved back to town recently after a rough divorce, and they quickly bonded over their shared experiences. She was kind, funny, and easy to talk to. Everything Lena hadn't been in a long time. They started meeting up for coffee, then dinners, and before long, Max found himself looking forward to their time together. Sarah had a way of making him laugh, of reminding him that there was still joy to be found in life. She didn't push him to open up, but she was there when he needed someone to talk to. Max found comfort in her presence, a warmth that he hadn't felt in years. As his relationship with Sarah grew, Max felt a sense of peace that he hadn't experienced in a long time. He realized that maybe, just maybe, he could find happiness again, even after everything he'd been through. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. One evening, as Max and Sarah were out for dinner, he received a text from Lena. She wanted to talk. She claimed she'd made a mistake, that she missed him, and that she wanted to come back. Max was torn. A part of him had been waiting for this moment, hoping that Lena would realize what she'd lost. But another part of him, the part that had found peace with Sarah, knew that going back would only bring more pain. He had finally started to heal, to find himself again, and he wasn't sure if he was willing to risk that for someone who had betrayed him. He spent the next few days wrestling with his emotions, trying to decide what to do. Lena's message had stirred up feelings he thought he'd buried, and he couldn't deny that he still cared for her. But at the same time, he knew that he deserved better, that he deserved someone who would love him without conditions or betrayals. After days of reflection, Max finally came to a decision. He would meet Lena, but he wouldn't let her back into his life so easily. He needed closure, a chance to say goodbye to the woman he'd once loved and to move on for good. If you're invested in seeing how Max handles this new chapter, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next part of the story. This journey is far from over, and there are more twists and turns to come. After days of internal conflict, Max finally decided he needed to meet with Lena, not to rekindle their marriage but to find closure. He was done letting her ghost haunt his life, and if he was going to move forward, he needed to end things on his terms. He arranged to meet her at a small cafe on the edge of town, a place they'd once frequented in happier times. This time, though, he felt a different kind of anticipation, a determination to finally put an end to the chapter that had brought him so much pain. When Lena walked in, Max barely recognized her. There was a vulnerability in her eyes that he hadn't seen before, a hint of regret that felt almost foreign. They exchanged a brief, awkward greeting before sitting down, and for a few moments, there was only silence. Finally, Lena spoke, her voice shaky. "Max, I know I've hurt you, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know that I'm sorry. I messed up, I was so focused on what I thought I wanted that I lost sight of what I already had. Max listened, his expression unreadable. He'd waited for these words, but now that he was hearing them, they didn't bring the relief he'd expected. Part of him wanted to forgive her, to believe that things could go back to the way they were. But another part of him, the part that had found peace with Sarah, knew that forgiveness wouldn't erase the betrayal. I appreciate you saying that, Lena, Max replied, his voice calm but firm. But I can't pretend that things can just go back to normal. You made your choice and I made mine. I've moved on, and I'm not willing to go through that pain again. Lena's face fell, and for a moment, he saw a glimpse of the woman he'd once loved. But he knew it was too late. Her apology was like a band-aid on a wound that had already scarred over. They talked a bit more, exchanging words of closure that finally allowed Max to feel a sense of peace. As he left the cafe, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He knew he'd made the right decision, and he was finally ready to embrace his new life. And when he thought about Sarah, he felt a warmth that reminded him of the future he was now free to build. Meanwhile, Lena's departure didn't go as smoothly as she'd hoped. Darren, who she'd left Max for, turned out to be far less committed than he'd pretended. Shortly after Max refused to reconcile, Lena discovered that Darren had been seeing other women the entire time. It was a bitter pill to swallow, realizing that she'd destroyed her marriage for a man who didn't care about her nearly as much as she thought. In a way, it was poetic justice, though Max didn't feel the need to revel in it. Max's newfound freedom allowed him to explore his relationship with Sarah more openly. They spent more time together, going on weekend trips and rediscovering the joy of shared experiences. For the first time in years, Max felt alive again, like he was rediscovering parts of himself he'd forgotten. Sarah became his anchor, a reminder that love could be kind and stable without losing its spark. She was the calm after the storm, and Max knew that he was finally where he was meant to be. Just as Max was beginning to feel like his life was back on track, a twist he never saw coming threw him for a loop. One afternoon, while he was working at the auto shop, he got a call from Lena. He debated whether to answer, not wanting to disrupt the peace he'd worked so hard to achieve, but something told him to pick up. Max, Lena's voice was trembling. I need your help. Against his better judgment, Max agreed to meet her, and when he arrived at her apartment, he found her in tears. Lena explained that Darren had been harassing her ever since their breakup, showing up unannounced and making threats when she didn't give him the attention he demanded. She was afraid, and as much as she hated to admit it, Max was the only person she trusted to help her. Part of Max wanted to walk away, to tell Lena that she'd made her bed and now had to lie in it. But despite everything, he couldn't ignore her fear. He agreed to help, on the condition that this was the last time she would ask for his support. Lena reluctantly agreed, and Max set out to confront Darren, hoping to put an end to the chaos once and for all. When he found Darren, he didn't mince words. He told Darren to stay away from Lena, making it clear that there would be consequences if he didn't back off. Darren laughed at first, dismissing Max as the boring ex-husband. But Max's resolve soon made him realize that he wasn't joking. After that encounter, Darren backed off, and Lena was finally able to find some peace. She thanked Max for his help, but he didn't linger. He'd done his duty, but he was ready to move on once and for all. Back at home, Max shared the whole ordeal with Sarah, who listened patiently. She didn't judge him for helping Lena. She knew that despite everything, Max was a man who cared deeply for others. It was one of the things she loved about him, and she assured him that he'd made the right choice. With Darren out of the picture, Lena decided it was time to leave town. She needed a fresh start, a chance to rebuild her life away from the mistakes she'd made. She said goodbye to Max, leaving him with a sense of finality that he hadn't felt before. It was truly the end, and Max could finally close that chapter of his life for good. With Lena gone, Max and Sarah continued to build their life together. They spent their days enjoying the simple pleasures that had once been so elusive to Max, and he found a sense of fulfillment he hadn't thought possible. Sarah became his rock, the person he knew he could rely on no matter what life threw their way. And as time passed, he realized that he'd finally found the happiness he'd been searching for all along. Thanks for tuning into this story. If you've enjoyed it, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel. There's always more to come, so stay tuned for the next story. Max thought he'd found closure, finally ready to move on with his life. But fate seemed to have a different plan. Just as he and Sarah began to settle into their newfound happiness, a sudden, unexpected twist threw everything into chaos. One evening, after a peaceful day spent hiking with Sarah, Max received a call from his mother. She rarely called at night, so he knew something had to be wrong. As soon as he picked up, he could hear the urgency in her voice. "Max, it's Lena. She's in the hospital." Max's heart dropped. He hadn't heard from Lena since she left town, and a part of him had hoped it would stay that way. But the concern in his mother's voice pushed aside any bitterness he might have felt. He needed to know what had happened. When Max arrived at the hospital, he learned that Lena had been in a car accident on her way back to town. She'd suffered a broken leg and a few other injuries, but was expected to make a full recovery. Seeing her in a hospital bed, frail and vulnerable, was a shock. This was the same woman who had once been the center of his world. And though he'd let her go, seeing her like this stirred something deep inside him. Lena's face softened when she saw him, and she gave a weak smile. "Max, I didn't think you'd come." He took a deep breath, trying to keep his emotions in check. "Of course I came. What happened, Lena? Why were you coming back?" She hesitated, looking away. I was going to see you. I know I hurt you, Max, and I know it's too late to fix things, but I needed you to know that I'm sorry. For everything." Max didn't know how to respond. This was the apology he'd wanted for so long. But now, with his life on a new path, he wasn't sure he needed it anymore. But he listened, letting her speak, sensing that she needed this moment of honesty as much as he did. Over the next few days, Max visited Lena at the hospital a couple of times. Sarah, ever understanding, encouraged him to offer Lena the closure she seemed to need. Lena was physically healing, but it was clear her spirit was broken. She confessed that she'd made a series of bad decisions, driven by a need for excitement that had ultimately left her empty. Darren, the man she thought would be her escape, had only made her feel more isolated and alone. Max listened with a calmness he hadn't expected. He felt sympathy for her, but he no longer felt responsible for her happiness. Their time together had come and gone, and now he was ready to move forward, not backward. But then, just as Lena was preparing to leave the hospital, Darren made an unwelcome return. He showed up unexpectedly, storming into her room and demanding that she come back to him. Max happened to be there at the time, helping Lena gather her things, and when he saw Darren's agitated state, he knew this was going to be a confrontation he couldn't avoid. Darren was angry, accusing Lena of leading him on and blaming her for the state of his life. It was clear that he'd lost control, his anger bubbling over as he threw harsh words her way. Max felt his blood boil, but he knew he needed to stay calm. "Darren, this isn't the place for this," Max said, stepping between him and Lena. "She doesn't owe you anything." Darren's face twisted in anger, and he scoffed. "And who are you to tell me what she owes? She left you, remember? She came to me because you weren't enough." Max clenched his fists, feeling the familiar pang of old wounds. Darren's words opened up. But instead of reacting, he took a deep breath, knowing that he couldn't let this man get the better of him. "This isn't about the past. It's about what she wants now, and it's clear she doesn't want you in her life." Lena, clearly shaken, looked at Max with gratitude and fear. Darren was relentless, though, refusing to leave until he'd had his say. Security eventually escorted him out, but the encounter left Max and Lena rattled. It was a stark reminder of the toxicity that had defined her relationship with Darren. Later that night, Max sat with Sarah, telling her about the confrontation. Sarah listened intently, her calm presence grounding him. He realized, then, how grateful he was for her steady, unwavering support. Unlike Lena, Sarah had never made him feel inadequate. She accepted him for who he was, and he knew he didn't need to prove himself to her. It was a comfort he'd never truly felt before, and in that moment he knew he'd made the right choice. But just as he began to relax, thinking that Darren was out of their lives for good, he received another shock. Darren, fueled by anger and desperation, started harassing both Max and Lena, sending threatening messages and making late-night calls. The harassment escalated quickly, and soon it became clear that Darren was dangerous. Lena was terrified, and though Max was determined to protect her, he knew they couldn't handle this alone. Max contacted the police, but they told him there was little they could do unless Darren made a physical move. Frustrated but undeterred, Max doubled down on his efforts to keep both Lena and Sarah safe. He began staying vigilant, keeping watch over his home and refusing to let Darren's threats intimidate him. One evening, as Max and Sarah were preparing to settle in for the night, they heard a loud bang on the door. Max's heart raced as he went to check. His worst fears confirmed when he saw Darren standing there, clearly intoxicated and looking for trouble. "Come out, Max," Darren shouted, his voice slurred and full of anger. "You think you can just take everything from me?" Max stepped outside, carefully closing the door behind him to keep Sarah safe inside. He tried to reason with Darren, telling him that he needed to leave and that there was nothing to be gained from this confrontation. But Darren wouldn't listen, his anger blinding him to reason. The tension reached its breaking point as Darren lunged at Max, throwing a punch that sent him stumbling back. Max fought to keep his composure, determined not to let this escalate, but Darren kept coming, each punch more desperate and reckless than the last. Finally, Max managed to push Darren back, yelling for him to leave and never come back. As Darren staggered away, muttering threats and curses, Max felt a surge of relief mixed with exhaustion. He knew he'd won this battle, but the emotional toll weighed heavily on him. Inside, Sarah was waiting with open arms, her worry evident in her eyes. She embraced him, holding him close, and for the first time in a long time, Max allowed himself to let go of the tension he'd been carrying. He was safe, and more importantly, he was free from the ghosts of his past and the chaos that had threatened to consume him. In the days that followed, Max took legal steps to ensure that Darren wouldn't be able to harass him or Lena again. With a restraining order in place and the support of Sarah by his side, he felt a renewed sense of peace, a feeling that he was finally free to live the life he deserved. The ordeal had changed him, and he realized that sometimes letting go wasn't about forgetting the past, but about finding the strength to move forward. And as he looked at Sarah, he knew that he had found something rare and beautiful, a love built on trust, resilience, and the promise of a brighter future. Thanks for sticking with this story until the end. If you enjoyed this journey, remember to like, share, and subscribe for more stories just like this one. There's always more to come, so stay tuned. After the confrontation with Darren and obtaining the restraining order, Max hoped life would finally return to normal. He and Sarah began planning a small getaway, a chance to relax and put the recent turmoil behind them. They chose a cozy cabin by the lake, a place where they could disconnect from the world and just enjoy each other's company. As they packed their bags, a sense of excitement filled the air. It felt like the beginning of a new chapter, one free from the shadows of the past. Max looked over at Sarah, her eyes sparkling as she talked about hiking trails and sunsets over the water. He realized how lucky he was to have found someone who brought such joy into his life. The first couple of days at the cabin were blissful. They spent their mornings sipping coffee on the deck, afternoons exploring the woods, and evenings curled up by the fireplace. For the first time in a long while, Max felt truly at peace. But peace can be fragile. On the third night, as they sat by the fire roasting marshmallows, Max's phone buzzed. He considered ignoring it, not wanting anything to disrupt their tranquility, but something compelled him to check. It was a text from an unknown number. "You think a piece of paper can stop me? You're not safe anywhere." A chill ran down Max's spine. He showed the message to Sarah, her face mirroring his concern. "It's Darren," Max said, his voice barely above a whisper. "How did he get your number?" Sarah asked, worry creeping into her eyes. "I don't know, but we can't let him ruin this," Max replied, trying to sound reassuring, though he felt anything but. They decided to report the message to the police first thing in the morning. For now, they tried to push it aside and enjoy the rest of their evening. But the unease lingered, a shadow over their happiness. That night, Max couldn't sleep. He lay awake listening to the sounds of the forest, every rustle and creak amplified in the darkness. He got up and looked out the window, half expecting to see Darren lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing but trees and the faint glow of the moon. The next morning, they drove into town to contact the local authorities. The officer they spoke to took the threat seriously and assured them that they would keep an eye out. They also advised Max to stay vigilant and report any further contact. Trying not to let the incident spoil their trip, Max and Sarah decided to go for a hike. The fresh air and exercise helped clear their minds, and for a while, they managed to forget about Darren's ominous message. As they reached a scenic overlook, Sarah took Max's hand. "No matter what happens, we'll face it together," she said, her eyes full of determination. Max smiled, squeezing her hand gently. "I don't know what I'd do without you." They shared a tender moment, the world around them fading away, but their respite was short-lived. On their way back to the cabin, they noticed a car parked near the entrance to the trail. A sleek black car that looked eerily familiar. "Is that?" Sarah began. "Darren's car," Max finished, his jaw tightening. They exchanged worried glances. "We should go back to town," Sarah suggested. Before they could turn around, Darren stepped out from behind a tree, blocking their path. His eyes were wild, and there was a menacing grin on his face. "Going somewhere?" he sneered. Max positioned himself between Darren and Sarah. "What are you doing here, Darren? You need to leave. Now." Darren chuckled. "Oh, I don't think so. You see, I've got nothing left to lose. You took everything from me." "That's not true," Max retorted. "You brought this on yourself." "Did I?" Darren's expression darkened. "You always thought you were better than me. Even back when Lena was with you, she was always looking for something more. And now you've got Sarah. Must be nice." "This isn't about them," Max said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Just walk away, Darren. It's over." "Not until I say it's over," Darren snapped, pulling out a small knife from his pocket. Sarah gasped, and Max's heart pounded in his chest. He knew they were in real danger. "Stay behind me," he whispered to Sarah. Darren advanced slowly. "You think you can just take what's mine and get away with it?" "She's not yours, Darren," Max said firmly. "No one is." Darren lunged forward, and Max instinctively grabbed a fallen branch from the ground, using it to block the attack. The two men struggled, the sounds of their scuffle echoing through the quiet forest. "Mox!" Sarah cried out, her voice filled with fear. "Run, Sarah! Get help!" Max shouted, trying to keep Darren at bay. But Sarah hesitated, torn between fleeing and staying to help. Seeing her distress, Max knew he had to end this quickly. Summoning all his strength, Max managed to knock the knife out of Darren's hand. It skittered across the ground, out of reach. Enraged, Darren tackled Max, and they both tumbled to the ground. The fight was fierce, both men fueled by adrenaline and emotion. But Max had something Darren didn't, a reason to fight for. He thought of Sarah, of the future they wanted to build, and he refused to let Darren destroy it. With a final surge, Max overpowered Darren, pinning him to the ground. "It's over, Darren. Stop this madness." Darren glared up at him, his facade of bravado crumbling. For a moment, Max saw the desperation in his eyes, the look of a man who had lost control. The sound of sirens in the distance broke the tension. Sarah had called the police, and they were on their way. "You'll regret this," Darren spat, but his words lacked conviction. "I already do," Max replied quietly. The police arrived moments later, taking Darren into custody. As they led him away, Max felt a wave of relief wash over him. It was finally over. Sarah rushed to his side, tears in her eyes. "Are you okay?" He pulled her into a tight embrace. "I am now." They gave their statements to the police, who assured them that Darren would face serious charges this time. With multiple violations of the restraining order and now an attempted assault, it was unlikely he'd be able to trouble them again. Back at the cabin, Max and Sarah sat together, the weight of the day's events settling in. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that," Sarah said softly. "It's not your fault," Max replied. "If anything, I should have seen this coming." "You couldn't have known," she insisted. "But we faced it together, and we're stronger for it." He looked into her eyes, grateful for her unwavering support. "I don't know what I'd do without you." "You'll never have to find out," she smiled gently. They decided to cut their trip short and return home, eager to leave the ordeal behind. In the weeks that followed, life began to settle into a new normal. Darren was being held without bail, and the legal process moved forward. One afternoon, Max received a letter from Lena. He hesitated before opening it, unsure of what she could possibly have to say. Inside, he found a heartfelt apology. "Max, I heard about what happened with Darren, and I can't express how sorry I am that you were dragged into this mess. I never meant for any of this to happen. You didn't deserve the pain I've caused you. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me someday. I truly wish you all the happiness in the world. Lena." Max folded the letter thoughtfully. He felt a sense of closure, realizing that the chapter with Lena was truly over. He didn't harbor anger anymore, just a quiet understanding that people change, and life moves on. That evening, he shared the letter with Sarah. She read it silently, then looked up at him. "How do you feel?" "Relieved, I think," he admitted. "It's like a weight has been lifted." She nodded, taking his hand.
"I'm glad."
"You deserve peace." He smiled softly. "We both do." As the months passed, Max and Sarah grew closer than ever. They decided to buy a house together, a symbol of the new life they were building. Surrounded by friends and family, they celebrated their engagement, filled with hope and joy for the future. One sunny afternoon, as they walked hand in hand through their favorite park, Max paused. "You know," he began, "I never imagined I'd find happiness like this again." Sarah leaned her head on his shoulder. "Life has a funny way of surprising you." He kissed the top of her head. "I'm just glad I didn't let the past keep me from seeing what's right in front of me." She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the warmth of the sun. "Here's to new beginnings." "To new beginnings," he echoed, feeling a profound sense of contentment. The shadows of the past had finally faded, replaced by the bright promise of tomorrow. Max had faced his trials and come out stronger, and now, with Sarah by his side, he was ready to embrace whatever life had in store. Thanks for staying with us through this emotional journey. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales that touch the heart. Until next time, Max never thought he'd see the day when the chaos of his past would catch up with him like this. But here it was, undeniable and raw. Even after everything he'd been through with Lena and Darren, he had believed they were finished, that they were safely in the rearview mirror of his life. But the past has a way of clawing its way back into the present when you least expect it. The night after the confrontation with Darren, Max tried to push the overwhelming tension out of his mind. They'd done everything they could. The police were involved, the restraining order was in place, and Darren was finally behind bars. But that didn't make it any easier. He couldn't shake the images of Sarah looking at him in fear, the way her voice cracked as she begged him to be careful. He'd promised her things would be okay, but as he lay in bed next to her, he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. The phone buzzed again in the middle of the night. Max's heart dropped as he looked at the screen. It was an unknown number. "What now?" he muttered, groggily answering it. "Max." The voice on the other end was strained, almost whispering. It was Lena. "Lena," Max replied, his chest tightening. "What do you want?" "I'm sorry for everything," she began, the words sounding rehearsed but strained with emotion. "But it's not over. Darren, he's out." Max's blood ran cold. "What do you mean? He's supposed to be in jail." "Not anymore. He got out on bail. Her voice broke, and Max could hear her sobbing. "He came to my apartment tonight. I didn't know what to do."
"Max, I'm scared."
"I don't know what he's going to do." Max shot up in bed, instantly alert. He glanced over at Sarah, who was still asleep, blissfully unaware. But now everything felt wrong, like a storm had suddenly shifted its course. "Where are you?" "I'm coming right now." "No," Lena quickly interjected. "Max, please, you don't have to come. He said he'll leave me alone if I don't get you involved. Just stay away." The words cut through Max like a knife, but he couldn't ignore the fear in her voice. He knew he couldn't just let this go. He owed it to her and to himself to make sure this was over for good. "I'm coming," Max said firmly, not even waiting for a response before hanging up the phone. Lena's apartment was in a rundown building on the edge of town, a place that used to feel like home but now felt like a haunted memory. When Max arrived, the building was dark, with only a few faint lights from the street lamps flickering in the distance. He could already feel the dread building in his chest as he climbed the creaky staircase. When he reached the door to Lena's apartment, it was cracked open. Max's instincts told him to be cautious, but the sheer urgency drove him forward. He knocked, but there was no answer. He pushed the door open a little more and stepped inside. The apartment was eerily quiet. Max's breath hitched as he looked around, seeing only a dim light coming from the kitchen. That's when he heard a sound. A door creaking, followed by a muffled sob. Max quickly made his way toward the sound. In the kitchen, Lena was sitting at the table, trembling, her hands clasped tightly together. Her eyes met his wide with fear. "He's gone, Max. He said if I didn't call you, he'd come back and make me regret it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Max knelt down beside her. "Lena, listen to me. It's over. I'm going to make sure of it." But Lena shook her head, her tears now falling freely. "No, it's not. You don't understand. Darren. He's not going to let this go. He won't stop until he gets what he wants." Max gritted his teeth, his anger rising. This was it, the final confrontation he had been dreading. He wasn't going to let Darren destroy everything he'd fought for. He stood up, ready to take charge of the situation. But just as he reached the door to leave, he heard a sound. A low, guttural voice from behind him. "Well, well, well. Look who's come to play hero." Max turned to see Darren standing in the doorway, his posture wild and unhinged. His eyes glinted with madness, and there was no mistaking the knife in his hand. Max's heart pounded in his chest, his body instinctively tensing as he faced Darren down. "I told you, Darren. Stay away from her." Darren's lips curled into a smirk. "You think you can stop me? You think this little piece of paper is going to keep me away?" Max's hands balled into fists, his muscles tense and ready for a fight. This time he wasn't going to back down. Not for Lena. Not for Sarah. This was about ending this nightmare once and for all. "You're the one who's going to regret this," Max said through gritted teeth. Darren lunged, his arm raised to strike, but Max was ready. He sidestepped Darren's attack, grabbing the knife by the hilt and twisting it out of his grip in one smooth motion. The metal clattered against the floor as Darren stumbled back, momentarily disoriented. But it wasn't over yet. Darren recovered quickly, a fire burning in his eyes. "You think you can defeat me? I'll show you how far I'll go to take what's mine." Max knew this wasn't just a physical battle anymore. It was about winning back control of his life and making sure Darren never got the chance to take it from him again. He backed Darren into the corner of the room, his voice cold and authoritative. "You're done, Darren. This is where it ends." Just as Darren's eyes darkened with rage and he prepared to make one final, desperate move, the sound of sirens wailed in the distance. Max didn't flinch. He wasn't afraid of Darren anymore. Within seconds, the door flew open, and the police rushed in, surrounding Darren. He was subdued quickly, his violent threats now nothing but empty words. Max exhaled deeply, his entire body sagging in relief. Lena, too, looked like she could finally breathe again. She stepped forward, her voice quiet but resolute. "It's over." Darren was dragged away, his threats fading into the background as the police took him into custody. Max and Lena exchanged a brief, understanding glance before Max turned back to Sarah. He could see the worry etched across her face as she stood at the door, her eyes searching for him. Max walked over to her, his gaze softening when their eyes met. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "I'm so sorry," Max whispered, his voice shaking with emotion. "I never wanted you to be caught up in this." Sarah held him just as tightly, her voice steady despite the fear she must have felt. "It's okay. We made it through. Together." For the first time in a long while, Max felt that everything was finally right. The battle was over and he had won. But the most important thing wasn't the victory. It was the peace he'd found in Sarah's arms. They had both been through so much, but now they had each other. Thanks for sticking with us until the end. If you've enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. There's always more to come, and you won't want to miss what happens next. Max couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was behind him. The weeks following Darren's arrest were filled with an uneasy calm, as if the world had paused, waiting for something to happen. For Max, the tension lingered, but he refused to let it define his new life with Sarah. They moved into a new home, a fresh start, and despite the shadows of the past, it felt like they were finally beginning to build the future they'd both dreamed of. But as life seemed to settle, a new storm was about to form. Started with a phone call. Max was in the middle of unpacking boxes in their living room when his phone buzzed. He didn't recognize the number, but something about it made his heart race. He answered without hesitation. "Max." A voice on the other end said, cold and distant, "You thought it was over, didn't you?"
Max froze.
The voice was unmistakable. It was Darren. "Darren, what do you want?" Max's voice was firm, but underneath it, there was a growing sense of dread. "I want what's mine, Max," Darren sneered. "You thought I'd stay locked up forever? You're wrong. I'm coming for you. For everything." Max's blood ran cold. He looked over at Sarah, who was sitting on the couch, her face still uncertain after everything that had happened with Darren. He couldn't let this continue. He couldn't let this nightmare unfold again. "You won't get away with this," Max said, trying to sound confident. "You're done, Darren. I'll be seeing you soon, Max." Darren's voice was filled with menace before the line went dead. Max dropped the phone in disbelief. His heart pounded in his chest. He had thought it was over, Darren in jail, the restraining order, everything. He had worked so hard to rebuild his life, to find peace with Sarah, but now it seemed that peace had been a lie. Sarah was immediately by his side, her expression filled with concern. "What happened?" "It's Darren," Max muttered. "He's out. He's threatening me again." A chill settled over Sarah as the weight of his words sank in. "What do we do? What does he want?" "I don't know," Max replied, pacing the room. "But we can't wait around for him to show up. We need to get ahead of this." The next few days were a blur of constant vigilance. Max contacted the police again, explaining the situation, but this time they were less reassuring. There was little they could do unless Darren made a move, and with Darren's release from jail, there were only so many precautions they could take. Max installed additional security cameras around their home, and he even started carrying a weapon, unsure of what kind of threat Darren posed now. Sarah, too, felt the growing tension. She noticed how Max's posture had changed, how he was always on edge, constantly scanning the perimeter, watching for movement in the shadows. It was exhausting for him, and it was beginning to take a toll on their relationship. One evening, as they sat together at dinner, Sarah finally broke the silence. "Max, we can't keep living like this. I know you're doing everything you can, but we can't let Darren control us anymore." Max looked at her, his eyes weary. "I know, but what am I supposed to do? He won't stop." "Then we make him stop," Sarah said, her voice firm. "We can't hide forever. We need to take charge of this, Max. For both of us." Max was silent for a moment, taking in her words. He'd been so focused on the fear, on the constant threat hanging over them, that he hadn't allowed himself to truly think about what they needed. He wasn't alone anymore. He had Sarah, and maybe it was time to stop running, to stop letting fear dictate his life. "You're right," Max finally said, his voice steady. "We're not going to let him control us. We'll face this together." The next few weeks became a tense waiting game. Max and Sarah worked together to fortify their home, making sure they had the best security systems in place. Max began keeping a more detailed log of any unusual activity, just in case Darren showed up again. Despite everything, he refused to let Darren win. Not now, not after everything they had overcome. Then, one night, it happened. Max was up late, scanning through footage from the security cameras on his phone, when he noticed something moving in the shadows outside the house. His breath caught in his throat as he zoomed in, seeing a figure standing by the fence. Tall, hunched, and unmistakably familiar. It was Darren. Max immediately sprang into action, grabbing his phone and dialing the police. Sarah, who had been in the other room, rushed to his side when she heard him speak urgently into the phone. "Stay inside. Lock all the doors," Max instructed, his voice tight with urgency. As Max kept an eye on the footage, he saw Darren move toward the back door, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator closing in on its prey. The police dispatcher confirmed they were on their way, but Max knew they wouldn't arrive in time. "Sarah, I need you to get to the safe room. Now," he ordered, his eyes not leaving the screen. Sarah hesitated, but the look in Max's eyes told her everything she needed to know. He wasn't asking her. He was telling her. They had no time to waste. She nodded quickly and ran to the back of the house, where Max had already set up a small, fortified room with enough supplies to keep them safe if anything happened. Max kept his focus, watching Darren move closer to the house, each step tightening the knot in his stomach. Max stood by the front door, his muscles coiled, every sense alert. He wasn't going to let Darren get anywhere near Sarah. Just as Darren reached the door, Max heard the unmistakable sound of sirens approaching. The police had arrived, but Darren wasn't giving up that easily. He pounded on the door, trying to break it down, and Max could feel the air around him crackle with the intensity of the moment. The next few seconds felt like an eternity. Darren's face twisted with rage as he continued to slam his shoulder into the door, but Max didn't flinch. He stood his ground, knowing that this was the moment everything changed. He wasn't running anymore. He wasn't afraid. And just as Darren made one final charge, the police stormed in from the back. They quickly subdued him, the weight of the confrontation finally coming to an end. Max stood still, his breath coming in heavy gasps, feeling the tension leave his body. Darren was arrested again, this time with more serious charges, and he was quickly taken into custody without a chance to make another threat. Max watched him being led away, the final remnants of fear dissolving with each step. That night, Max and Sarah sat together in the quiet of their living room, both feeling the weight of what had just happened. "We did it," Max said quietly, his voice filled with disbelief. "It's over." Sarah nodded, leaning into him. "We made it through. Together." Max held her close, feeling the comfort of her presence. It wasn't just the end of a nightmare. It was the beginning of a new chapter. No more fear. No more shadows. The future was theirs to create. Thanks for sticking with us through this roller coaster of emotions. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. Stay tuned, because the journey's far from over. As the dust settled from that final confrontation, Max couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of relief wash over him. For months, he'd lived with the constant threat of Darren's presence, a shadow hanging over his life, suffocating the peace he and Sarah were trying to build. But now, with Darren safely in custody, it felt like the nightmare had finally come to an end. The police assured Max that Darren would face serious charges this time. He wasn't just looking at a few months behind bars. This was a long sentence, one that would keep him away for good. Max knew this time there wouldn't be any quick release. The law would take its course, and Darren's reign of terror would be over. But even with the danger gone, there was still work to do. Max took a long, hard look at his life, and he realized how much he'd changed over the past few months. The fear, the tension, it had all been consuming. And now, with the threat gone, he could finally breathe again. As he sat down next to Sarah later that night, after everything had calmed down, he looked at her, her head resting against his shoulder. They had been through so much together, and yet here they were, still standing. He knew they were stronger now, their bond forged through the fires of fear and uncertainty. "We made it through," Sarah whispered, as if reading his thoughts. Max nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "Yeah, together." She smiled softly, a quiet but sincere smile that reflected the strength of their relationship. "It hasn't been easy, but we're here. We're finally here." Max smiled back, knowing that it wasn't just about surviving the chaos. It was about coming out on the other side stronger, more united. The past had shaped them, yes, but it didn't define them. They were ready to move forward, hand in hand, building a future free from the fear that had once held them captive. In the days that followed, Max and Sarah slowly but surely began to rebuild their lives. The tension that had plagued their relationship lifted, replaced by a quiet optimism. They spent more time together, enjoying the little things they'd taken for granted before. Cooking dinner together, taking long walks, talking late into the night about their hopes and dreams for the future. Max found himself reflecting more on what he'd learned throughout this ordeal. He'd always thought of himself as a man who could handle anything life threw his way, but the truth was, he'd been blind to some of the things that really mattered. His relationship with Sarah, his ability to communicate, his need to protect those he loved. All of these things had been put to the test, and in the end, they had proven to be stronger than the fear that had once controlled him. One day, as they sat on the porch, watching the sun set behind the hills, Max turned to Sarah, his heart full. "I never thought I could be this happy again," he said quietly. "I thought after everything that happened, I'd be too broken to move forward." "You're not broken, Max," Sarah replied, squeezing his hand. "You're stronger than you think. We both are." Max smiled, feeling the truth of her words settle deep in his chest. She was right. They had made it through the darkest times, and they had come out on the other side with a deeper understanding of themselves and each other. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about thriving, living fully in the present, and cherishing the love they had built. As for Darren, his life was no longer a threat to theirs. The legal proceedings moved quickly, and he was sentenced to a lengthy prison term. He would never be able to harm anyone again. For Max, there was a sense of justice in seeing Darren finally face the consequences of his actions. But even more than that, it was the peace of mind that came with knowing he had won. He had faced down his fears, protected his loved ones, and emerged victorious. And with Darren behind bars, Max could finally focus on what really mattered: his future with Sarah. They decided to take their relationship to the next level, making plans for their wedding and talking about the kind of life they wanted to create together. Max knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, but with Sarah by his side, he felt ready to face whatever challenges life might throw their way. Months later, when the wedding day finally arrived, Max stood at the altar, his heart pounding in his chest, not from fear, but from excitement. Sarah walked down the aisle toward him, and in that moment all the pain, all the fear, all the hardship they had endured seemed so far away. This was their moment. This was the beginning of something beautiful. They exchanged vows, promises to support and love each other, no matter what. As they sealed their commitment with a kiss, Max felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. They had come so far, and now the future was theirs to shape. In the months that followed, Max and Sarah settled into a new rhythm. Life wasn't perfect. There would always be challenges, always be moments of doubt. But they were no longer defined by fear or the ghosts of their past. They had learned to live in the moment, to cherish the love they shared, and to build a future filled with hope. Max often thought back to those dark days when Darren had terrorized their lives. He remembered the fear, the uncertainty, and the sense of helplessness that had clouded his vision. But now he saw things differently. He had learned that real strength wasn't just about fighting the battles in front of him. It was about knowing when to ask for help, when to lean on the people who loved him, and when to face the hard truths about himself. He had learned that love wasn't always easy, but it was always worth fighting for. As Max and Sarah stood on the porch one evening, watching the sunset together, Max realized that he had everything he'd ever wanted. Not in terms of material possessions, but in the love and peace he had found. He had learned to face the darkness and come out into the light, hand in hand with the person he loved most. And with that, they turned toward the future, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. Thanks for sticking with us through this journey. If you enjoyed the story, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. More adventures are coming your way, so stay tuned.